Welcome to the GreenPilled Network podcast. If you are just joining us, we are building a network society of thousands of hackers, dreamers, and doers focused on using crypto to bring positive-sum digital systems to the world. This podcast features the people who are doing it, and we publish a season of 5 to 10 episodes every couple months. This season is about impact. How can we manifest the meme of impact equals profit? How can we elevate the most interesting experiments and ideas in impact tracking? How can we build crypto economic systems that elevate impactful builders? And how do we move from virtue signaling to crypto economic proof of virtue? These are the themes of GreenPill Impact Season 2024. Another experiment that we are doing for Impact Season is allowing you to collect this episode. So this episode with Juan, Benet, and all other episodes from this season will be available at pods.media/greenpill. And if you go there, you will find the episodes and be able to start collecting them as NFTs. If you want to learn more about GreenPill.network, visit our website at GreenPill.network, where you can download the GreenPill book for free, join the Discord, and become a member of your local GreenPill.network chapter. Okay, with that intro out of the way, I am very excited to introduce today's guest, who is Juan Benet, the founder of Filecoin and the creator of IPFS. We are talking about productionizing R&D. So basically, how do we get through the uncanny valley between research and actually productionizing and scaling new technologies? Juan is a builder who has felt this acutely through his creation of IPFS and as the founder of Protocol Labs and Filecoin. We talk about Juan's early journey in starting IPFS and trying to figure out how he was going to fund it. He looked at tech companies, he looked at government grants, and we talked about the uncanny valley in between creating IPFS and actually productionizing it. And we talk about how the incentive field is just sort of broken in between the creation of new technology and the productization of new technology. I saw Juan talk about this at DevConnect, and I knew that during that time I had to have him on Greenpill Impact Season to talk about this problem. We talk about how the incentives are broken. We talk about how the existing models like IP do not work, and how new on-chain primitives like hypercerts and other things could be used in order to bottle up those innovations and help them cross this chasm a little bit more reliably. Then we talk about the upside for humanity of that happening. What if crypto grows to be as large as nation states like the United States and is funding public goods and is funding research at the scale that nation states like the United States or China are doing? And what would that mean for the creation of new technologies if we're able to solve this problem? So Juan is someone that I've long looked up to. He's long been a thought partner for me in creating more regen, protopian world. And I think it can't be a mistake that we're doing Impact Season here at Greenpill, and that Juan has been thinking about the exact same themes. So I think you're going to enjoy this episode. Without further ado, I give you Juan Benet. So good to have you again, Juan. So we wanted to talk about the R&D pipeline between research in science and productization. And can you tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing there and the thinking that you've been doing there?
Yeah, so probably it's maybe the thing that I've been most obsessed by in the last 10 12 years, trying to understand why, even though we have like this amazingly advanced civilization and we are doing so many amazing things all over the place, why R&D is proceeding so slowly. There are a lot of ways that you could measure this, and there's a lot of people that have talked a lot about this, and you know, and at the same time, like, we're can look around and be impressed by all the new things that are coming out, but by a lot of measures, you can see that humanity is just not innovating nearly as fast as we could be, and things are getting stuck along the way in the process. And so it took me a long time to kind of like understand all the different layers and piece together like the issues and so on. I used to kind of think that the big bottleneck was in science funding, where there were like these massive corporations that were able to develop a lot of technologies and build a lot of products and had a lot of capital, but a lot of the funding wasn't kind of like flowing all the way into science funding and basic research and so on. And after diving deep into this and so on, I realized that wasn't quite the case. Like the bottleneck is not in science funding; it's actually a little bit further downstream of that, in what the people at the labs used to call fundamental development, which is when you take some early research on some kind of basic fundamental concepts, and you then start translating that into what are the potential possible applications that you could develop. What kind of things could eventually turn into some innovation that could go into a device and then build a product and so on. And it's in that area that I think like the biggest bottleneck is today. Like I've since kind of structured this in terms of a pipeline, like a broader R&D pipeline. And this is of course like many institutions have modeled it this way for a very long time. And I've kind of landed on maybe 5 stages, kind of like early basic research, fundamental development, which is kind of what I was describing as where the bottleneck is. Productionizing, and this is a word that I borrowed from Bell Labs and many other groups, which is kind of like where you go from like concrete devices that might work, but like you're trying to refine them into something that could eventually be put into a product, and kind of figuring out what the product is going to look like and what is the product that you're going to be manufacturing at scale or something like that, or delivering to the world at scale. And then after that, like you go into production, which is like, okay, you sort of like know what the product is. Now you need to kind of figure out how to produce it at scale, and give it out to the whole world. And then after that, there's kind of this broad word that I describe as scaling, which is like you now have a product in the market, you're delivering it to users, and you're now kind of like trying to compound that and grow it into a pretty large scale of benefit for everybody. And so this whole pipeline, people tend to think of R&D as maybe just the basic research part. But in reality, if you think of most successful R&D institutions, they tend to think about R&D as the whole thing. Like R&D is the process of going from extending what you know and doing like the basic fundamental research to understand more about the world, so like the science part, and the translation of that science part into concrete devices and technologies that you can then put into products and then sell into the world at scale. There was this old description from Bell Labs that if you hadn't sold a product at scale, you hadn't yet innovated. There was a very strong connection between actually delivering the products of some new scientific breakthrough into the hands of people as the measure of whether or not you actually had come up with something significant. Because there's so many like easy ways of figuring out new discoveries and new conceptual advancements, but if you don't kind of connect them all the way to something that is actually tangibly getting better around you, then you haven't quite realized the impact of that discovery, and you haven't been able to like compound the return of that discovery. Meaning, I tend to think of science and technology as two sides of the same kind of integrated process, which is not, one part is extending what you know, and the other part is extending what you can do. And of course, one feeds into they feed into each other, but you kind of need them both, and they're both parts of the same broader thing, which is kind of as a species we're getting to know more and extending what we know and so on. So this kind of like R&D pipeline that I've been I guess very obsessed by in the last 10, 12 years, I've kind of like more recently started to think through each of these stages and like what are the bottlenecks in each one, and how could we measure how well each of these are working, what are the blockers in each one of these, and whatnot. And I could probably spend a long time talking about this, but the kind of like summary statement is that we have like this huge funding gap in the fundamental development stage, where further downstream of that stage, when you get into like productionizing and production and scaling, you have the broad modern capital structures with large technology companies and and the startup environment and venture capital and so on. Like all of those systems are like working pretty well. Like of course there's problems, but like they're working pretty well at generating new innovative products and generating new technologies and developing them into the market and scaling them. And though of course there's bottlenecks and it could all be working better there, it's working way better than the fundamental development piece. And likewise in the earlier basic research stage, though of course like there's huge funding problems and so on, science in general tends to tends to get a lot of funding from a lot of the world. There are large amounts of money flowing into scientific research in a bunch of different areas. So there is a lot of basic research being done. There's lots of scientists producing really good things. And in reality, my view is like right now we're getting this pileup, this like buildup of basic research discoveries that aren't translating because we don't have a good incentive model in the fundamental development part, and it's leading to this like kind of what people in deep tech startups tend to call like the valley of death, where there's basically like zero funding, like it's way too early for VC to invest in. So like, kind of like the traditional capital structures don't work there, and it is way too late for any kind of scientific funding to kind of like scientific public goods government funding to support you, because you're not going to come up with some conceptual discovery. So it's not, there's no like grant money for you, and so that valley of death is like where most things get stuck. And so that's the area that I think is like most important to fix. And I think there's lots of different ways of doing this, but one of the basic areas is like figuring out better ways to route capital into those areas in a way that could be compounded, right? So I think I just there mentioned kind of two incentive fields. Like one is the capital incentive field, which is how companies and how startups and tech companies operate, where they kind of hook into like the rest of capitalism, and they create you create products that build on some technology, and those products get sold into the world, and they're able to kind of operate in that broad incentive field of if you produce a good product and you can sell it at scale and you can make some profit, then you can compound that. And I mentioned this other incentive field, which is kind of scientific funding, like public good scientific funding coming from governments or philanthropists and broad donors. And that was kind of invented in the early 20th century in order to, I mean, of course there were like other versions of this and scientific grants going back hundreds to potentially thousands of years, depending on how you want to look at it. But for the most part, like the modern version of this was really built in like in the early 20th century, going and really kind of got redefined around World War II, and the set of like scientific funding institutions that came out of that, especially in the U.S. but also in Europe and a few other places. That entire system got designed as governments need to deeply invest in basic research and funding of science so that society and civilization can advance. And so that created this additional incentive field. It's not connected to capital in the same way. It's connected to capital in maybe like a second or third order link, where if the entire country is doing better and like the whole GDP of the country is doing better, then maybe the budget of the country will be higher, and then the funding flow to science can be larger. But it's not kind of like directly connected in terms of like capital instruments. But then kind of fundamental development doesn't have any of these. Like it's way too early for the traditional normal capital incentive field to work, and it's way too late for most of the government funding to hit. And so this is where like we really need new incentive structures. We need new instruments that could be used here. And there's lots of different ways that you could approach this. Like one is by dragging the kind of like capital incentive field earlier by creating new investable assets that might work. The other path is you could try to stretch the scientific funding field by trying to give scientific credit for the fundamental development piece and creating like a very strong association of like rewards there. Or you could come up with like a totally new incentive field in place where like you could generate other kind of ways of rewarding this. Traditionally, the intellectual property incentive field is supposed to be there, but like it doesn't work very well. Sorry, I just kind of like went super deep and talked for a long time, so I can pause here.
That's great. Maybe I'll try to say some of that back to you just so the audience can hear it twice. So there's kind of like a inverse bell curve. If you look at the amount of funding as the y-axis, and then the stage of production as the x-axis, stage of production going from R&D to productionizing to production and scaling. You've got a lot of funding from governments and nonprofits to incentivize research in the research stage. At the end stage, you've got VC funding, you've got tech companies, you've got the private sector, which is really good at using markets in order to fund stuff, but there's kind of an uncanny valley. I think you called it a valley of death in between those, and it seems like the translation between government funding and private funding, like those two things are a little bit incompatible with each other. We don't have good structures for bringing things across that uncanny valley. And there's another challenge presented by the fact that there's just not a lot of funding for those in between stages. So we can either come up with new vehicles to help people cross that chasm, we can stretch government or nonprofit funding out, or we can bring market funding earlier. That's maybe reductionist, but that's a lot
Yeah,
of
yeah,
what I heard there.
yeah, totally. And I think it's kind of like interesting why each of these fields doesn't extend all the way. So like the venture capital field doesn't extend all the way because um, that earlier part in fundamental development is too early by kind of VC
Yeah,
standards.
too risky.
And what that means is like there's probably a host of different reasons. Like one is this area is like so early and removed from a product that usually the work done here tends to be pretty different from the work done in defining the product and defining what eventually turns into a startup. So the people might actually be different, meaning like in the traditional way that startups get built, which is kind of like you have an early founding team that's going to go build the whole thing and scale it. Um, this is probably the area where you're going to see like the most more turnover in terms of like the people that are going to be really good at fundamental development might not be that good at producing the actual products and scaling them. Another reason is the funds. The typical VC fund has like a 10 to 15 year time horizon. And that is basically just enough to get you through like the productionizing phase, like productionizing production and then scaling. And then going all the way back to fundamental development might require VC funds that last like 20 to 25 years. So if the norm in VC was to have 25-year funds, then we might actually kind of cover this whole field. And not just the length of time, but the size. So if you want to in kind of like dealing with VC portfolio math, like if you want to invest at that early stage, you you have a much higher likelihood of failure, like another order of magnitude or more. So that means like you need a portfolio that's an order of magnitude larger, and so that means you need that many more investments and that much more funding. So you deal with like then VC funds that are like in the single to $10 billion scale, and we just don't have VC funds like that. We have single $1 billion funds, and those are about as like maybe the largest one that I know of is like 4 billion, 5 billion or so. But it's not the norm to have like 10 billion to $15 billion scale VC funds. And so the VC in general can't quite stretch all the way to there, even though some of the best startups in history have been founded in that part, right? So when you think about like maybe Apple or SpaceX or things like Genentech and maybe Fairchild and Intel and so on, like some of the most important technology companies ever built had to go through that fundamental development stage. And if you kind of like were an investor that could invest in them at that stage, then you could get some of the best returns ever to really create this structure. But in general today, the VC kind of model and the VC game as it's kind of built out can't really afford to invest in that stage, even though some of the best startups will come out of that. And so, the typical description here that, many people have probably heard is like VC can't invest in research projects. And really what they mean is like, get through the research phase, get through the fundamental development phase, come to us once you can kind of figure out the product and you're there to scale it, because that's really like what VCs can afford. Like they can't really afford to invest earlier. And then kind of likewise in the scientific credit side, scientific credit tends to follow very significant conceptual breakthroughs that are going to be field redefining, that are going to enable a lot of people to look at things significantly differently, things that maybe generate an entire new field sometimes, or that just become these like breakthrough ideas that kind of move the thinking forward for everybody in a particular area. And scientists in general tend to kind of disregard or undervalue like derivative work that is kind of already building on important conceptual breakthroughs that already happened, and where you're really just kind of optimizing something, where you're just kind of changing it a bit and reshaping it. So putting it in R&D terms, this means like the conceptual breakthrough of making the transistor from like the very first one, like the actual like first physical device, was an amazing achievement that, you know, scientists around the world were really amazed by. But doing the work of like deciding whether you should use like one material or another, or like whether you could like make it twice as small or 10 times as small, or whether you should like use this particular refinement process versus another one, like that's just not that interesting to most scientists, and so it tends to not carry the level of scientific credit or scientific reputation. And so that means that in general the scientific reputation world is not going to care about those kinds of innovations nearly as much, and so you end up with this like huge drop off in the scientific credit field. And so that means like, and the weird thing here is that by my accounting, like the fundamental development phase takes about 10 to 20 times more work from scientists and engineers than the basic research part. And so we have an area that like takes way more time and effort that is way less funded. And so this is kind of the big bottleneck that is holding back just our civilization.
Juan, I'm curious if you could pinch and zoom a little bit as to how that would apply to protocol development, and maybe even kind of looking at specific examples of IPFS, of the P2P, and how you might pull that forward.
So in software, we are very lucky that, you know, experimentation is extremely cheap relative to most other areas, right? So already we're in a landscape where the entire R&D pipeline is way shorter. You can develop new ideas in software and get to, you know, do the research, the development, the productionizing, production and scaling in like a few years relative to, you know, in hardware. Like if you were trying to make a fusion reactor, or you were trying to do like create a find a new drug to cure a particular strand of cancer or something like that, you're looking at like 10 to 20 years or more. And so in software already, like you're playing on easy mode, you're able to like go much faster. And even then, when I was first making IPFS and I like was trying to decide like, should I go do this in like a tech company? Should I make a startup? Should I like make it as an open source project, kind of like work nights and weekends and, you know, have a day job somewhere else? Or should I go to like a university and do it as a PhD project? And like the outlook was bleak, even for an open source project. Like the outlook was terrible. Like in the science side, I went to talk to a few profs, and like the overwhelming response was like, kind of interesting, pretty derivative. Like maybe this part is interesting, and maybe you could write a paper about that, but like not quite enough for a PhD thesis. So like go do something else. And then on kind of like the company side, like just so difficult to try and convince a large company that to go and invest in something like this, to like develop it as an open source project. And you kind of like would give all the autonomy of the project over to, you know, kind of like whatever is like the quarterly benefit for that particular team in that particular company. So that means like most likely to be canceled, right? And so that really left like trying to create a startup around IPFS, and that requires finding a monetization path. And this is kind of like where Falcon came from, and which I kind of like wanted to have as a separate project for a bunch of reasons. Won't get into that now. Or to then do it as like nights and weekends as a separate project, and doing it as a side project, that just kind of consigns open source to go a lot slower. It just means that like it might take 20 years to get somewhere. So like this was what many great open source projects have done that and have become really successful, but have taken a lot longer to get developed. And so I knew that something like IPFS was going to require tens to hundreds of people working on it to really get somewhere. And so that just really left the route of like, okay, great, I just have to go and figure out how to build a startup. But even then, I had to do a bunch of work individually to find like a really solid monetization path, and something that was going to be much closer to production and scaling, and something that like was going to make a lot more sense than say something like IPFS that is much more fundamental as a public good, that is just kind of very far away from monetizing, right? And so that and kind of like I think like I was already playing on easy mode relative to like many other worlds, and even then there was just like there's no group that you could go to and try and get like some easy funding quickly. Even kind of like some very enlightened grant institutions that could have given money for this, like their application processes last months to quarters. And so it's just completely different than the startup landscape where you can raise funding in a week or somewhere between a week and 4 weeks. And so that's just kind of a totally different landscape. And so I think if we want to get really serious about funding massive scale public goods, we need to have vast amounts of capital to flowing in very short time scales. And we need, and that means like days to weeks, not, months to years. And we need extremely good measurement systems to figure out like, where are we doing a good job? And so that we can kind of like do the capital allocation correctly. And it's one of the key things with all of these systems, like the systems that succeed have an evolutionary structure to them where you can measure their success rate, and you can over time in like different rounds allocate better, meaning the VC system works because it's an evolutionary structure where if the VC fund is getting kind of bloated and making bad decisions, it's going to get replaced by another VC fund that does a better job. And you have like thousands of VC institutions competing with each other, trying to find the signal as best as possible. And so in general, as a distributed algorithm, it like works pretty well at finding the signal. In government funding, it's like not as clean as that and not as good as that. There are all kinds of like problems in government funding that stem from the fact that you have like these mega institutions that are allocating grants individually. You do have a lot more visibility and control and ability to invest in long-term projects that maybe short-term oriented profit-seeking entities just can't. But you have like all kinds of bias structures that end up preferring to fund mainstream type ideas and tend to underfund like really amazing breakthrough work that just isn't popular at the time. Examples of this might be like nanotech, or the fact that fusion like had such a big price tag that nobody wanted to do it for so long. Or where like if something is kind of politically difficult, like biotech or longevity or cryo, then you get like zero funding. And so it just becomes a huge bottleneck to fundamentally breakthrough work. And so you get this problem there. It's gotten better over the last 20 years in that now we have many more governments around the world taking the R&D, funding R&D much more seriously. But it used to be like primarily the US, right? So in the latter half of the 20th century, most of the scientific funding was the US and a few of the European countries. Since then, and Japan and South Korea as well, but like for the most part, not that much in the rest of the world. And now we have like a much better spot where there just really are many more countries doing massive scale R&D, especially China. China's become like one of the largest funders of R&D in the world. And so that's, I think, extremely good for the world, because you have many more institutions trying to do many more this kind of funding, and they themselves are embedded in this evolutionary structure where like the better they do, the more they're going to succeed, the more they're going to be able to compound those returns into funding more. Ideally, I would love to be able to like do this kind of thing in a broad international, like not kind of associated with a flag type of public goods oriented funding structures for humanity in general. And I think this is where like I find crypto just so exciting, because like we could generate new funding structures, new instruments, new mechanisms for deploying massive scale funding into these areas at the scale of nation states. It's one of the things that I find just so amazingly optimistic about this industry. It's like when you look at crypto networks, they're within like, some of them are already about as valuable in terms of the total like market cap and so on, and just the value they create as small country economies. And they're like within 2 or 3 orders of magnitude of being the scale of large country economies. And so that means that like if crypto just grows by 2 to 3 orders of magnitude in terms of the value it organizes, we would be able to then fund R&D at the scale of nation states. And like that's enormous. Like that we're talking about like a world shifting moment. Like if a crypto network like Ethereum or Filecoin or whatever is now suddenly funding R&D at the scale of the US, like that changes the entire kind of infrastructure of the world. And And especially if we can kind of like do it really well across all these stages and not end up with these like huge bottlenecks in the middle that are hard to kind of work through. And so this is why I find things like all of the work that we're doing around public goods, whether it's like the broad field building or individual instruments like hypercerts or credit attribution or other specific like components, just so exciting because like if we can get all these public goods money Legos figured out well, and we know how they work, and we can measure them and we can scale them, then as crypto broadly gets more and more successful, then we can route vast amounts of resource allocation budget into provisioning like massive scale public goods around the world, which I think is like a super optimistic vision of the future.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, Juan, what primitives you're really excited about. It seems like the job to be done is sort of to connect the impact or potential impact of the research stage all the way through to the productization and scaling stage, although it's very reductionist. What primitives are you excited about? How does crypto change the game in the broken incentive fields in order to change this for the better, if it does at all?
Yeah, so I think it totally can, and I think maybe I'll mention a few that I'm pretty excited about. So maybe I'll start with like the more simple ones, and then scale to like the weirder and more interesting ones. So the simpler ones are like just straight up better grant funding structure. So first off, what Gitcoin has been able to do, and in just figuring out ways of getting a lot more participants work deploying capital together in a way that more closely aligns with the goals of communities is like super valuable. Making grant processes just work more efficiently, work faster, reach larger scale, already massively valuable. I think there's a bunch of interesting work to do there on like how do we couple grant processes to some kind of sustainability structure in mind. So I think there's some groups that are starting to think about like grant programs coupled to investing funds where you have a lot of public goods grant funding happening, but then if any one of those projects ends up generating some value that could be captured in some way, then some amount of that value should flow back into the pool. And I think that those kinds of instruments will be pretty interesting. I think there's there's like this concept that we're kind of experimenting with called like we call like impact funds or brew funds, where it's kind of the analogous structure to a VC fund, but oriented for public goods funding, where instead of kind of creating large grant making agencies where like, you have a large treasury allocated by a small group or even by a large community voting through, QF or something like that. What if you could have like an evolutionary structure in there where you had a much larger number of smaller grant makers that were competing with each other? And I think that is like pretty promising as a mechanism to be able to like have some evolutionary dynamics here of getting better and better signal, of like really making sure that people are competing with each other to do the best job possible. Then I'm really excited about hypercerts specifically, because they give you a way of describing the credit of having done a bunch of the work, which gives you a composable structure that works across all the stages, right? So you can use hypercerts for any part of the stage. And so for fundamental development, you could like use hypercerts for that work being done. And you can retroactively reward and buy up those units. What we need in order to make this kind of thing work is we need like large volume hypercerts buyers on the other side, right? So we can scale this if we can get large amounts of capital flowing into buying the hypercerts on the other side of a particular stage. I think here's where I think it'll be harder to convince people to buy hypercerts for fundamental development in the early stages. I think it'll be easier to convince people to buy hypercerts for things like green refi oriented so work in, for example, like carbon credits are a special case of a hypercert. And so I think things like that are more tangibly connected to some broad-based impact on something that a lot of people recognize are going to be easier. And so I think simultaneously that hypercerts are going to be super valuable in this to solve this problem, but it might be harder to convince a lot of people unless maybe there's some governments that are kind of get it, or some corporations that sort of get it. Hypersources have the ability to connect IP to them. So maybe, and this is one of the things that David had, one of the the person that invented hypercerts, thought was going to be like a really good component here, is like if you can associate the IP of generating the invention in the fundamental development part, then maybe hypersource can be like a really successful piece here. I worry that IP in general just isn't a good mechanism today for small scale innovation. Like if you're kind of coming up with some improvements along the way, you can't really use patents or IP as a way to like generate significant income as an individual. Like, how many inventors do you know that whose like main full-time job is inventing, and they kind of like file patents and so on? I think maybe we could like fix this if we focused on fixing the IP field itself. So, another idea here is like, let's go and rethink the IP transaction and come up with better markets and better mechanisms for selling them. I tend to think of this as like the type of innovation that Airbnb did. So Airbnb was like a marketplace innovation that recast and reshaped a particular transaction. So there were people's rooms around. You could go and stay in people's houses. The way that transaction worked was like fairly difficult. You had to know somebody. You had to like know enough about their place. You had to like figure out if they were in town at the right time and so on. And they kind of like just reshaped that entire transaction by enabling you to tap the entire network, the entire community. They just kind of like reshaped how the transaction was meant to work, and then they opened up like an amazing new marketplace. This kind of thing could happen to IP by removing some of like the big toxic elements, which is like, it shouldn't be possible for the owner of IP to kind of prevent the entire world from using this, and like, from saving like thousands of lives or millions of lives, which happens today, right? Like today, as an IP owner, you could prevent, theoretically, legally, governments from using this to like save lives, which is like crazy to me. Like that just should not be a thing that you could do. You do need like some fair compensation in order to make the entire R&D process work. But instead of that being like an asking price, maybe IP can turn into, you have to describe the value of the thing, similar to real estate maybe, and you have to pay tax on it or something. Like if you want to have IP, maybe you have to declare what the value you think it is, and maybe you have to pay taxes on it. And maybe like arbitrage tax type structures, like anybody could buy the IP from you for that price at any moment in time. And maybe that kind of thing can make IP as a system like work better. So I think like this scenario where if we got like 100 to a couple hundred builders kind of experimenting in IP, like maybe we can generate a dramatically better structure. One other thing that I think is like heavily undervalued is just basic credit attribution, linking the thread of invention. So this is something that we explored in the source credit project in 2018, 2019, which is like, and I think there's a lot of good ideas there that it's probably time to like revisit that and try it again. This idea is like, if you can describe the credit that went into producing something, and you can figure out the transitive dependencies there, like, what scientific results built on what other scientific results, which usually gets tracked in the scientific literature reference graph, right? Like one paper cites another paper, or, one paper cites 10 papers, those 10 papers cite, 100 papers, whatever. You can figure out like that chain of discovery. But you also crucially map it to the development part, like this GitHub commit builds on this other important work, or this GitHub project has this other set of dependencies and these other GitHub projects, or these GitHub projects like depend on this set of scientific results. Like if you can kind of trace that credit attribution across the through line of all of this work, then that gives you the ability to do funding a totally different way, which is like, you can just pour money through that entire credit attribution graph and reward all of the participants that were involved in producing that work, which just gives you a very different way of doing resource allocation, right? At the end of the day, like transactions today and whatever economy you want to think of are just inventions, and they're a technology that we put in place and an operating system that we put in place because it like works well enough. And so like this kind of different way of doing it could do dramatically better in certain areas. And I think like that, I think there's like low hanging fruit there of experiments that somebody could go do that could like try it out. So for example, today you could take the entire scientific graph and all the references and instantiate a website where you, for each of these, you create like the credit attribution graph for each of the papers, linking to every other paper or whatever. And right away, like you could have a little credit attribution network of all the scientific literature in the world, and you could start flowing funding through it. Like nothing, there's nothing preventing you from doing that today.
That could be huge. It'd be so simple too.
Yeah.
That's so powerful.
So yeah, these are the kinds of things that I think like are pretty promising in the R&D space.
Amazing. Hey, real quick admin note. I know Carl, you have to run in 2 minutes. Juan, are you good to keep going, or if you have a hard stop, also we can head for the landing.
Yeah, I'm good to keep going, but I also I've been talking a lot, so I haven't been self-reflecting on what the how the.
No, it's great. You're dropping knowledge bombs. It's been good. Carl, you want to maybe lead the episode for 3 more minutes while you're still here?
Yeah, I have one thing that's been in my mind hearing you talk about the importance of creating composable funding is how do you generate the initial demand signal for these things? Like where is that going to come from? And if you think about like bootstrapping any of these ecosystems and creating an impact market around a new type of behavior that didn't exist before, there need to be some buyers that are going to lead and create that very strong initial demand signal. So where do you see that coming from?
Yeah, and in this, are we just specifically talking about hypercerts or just more generally?
I guess more generally, but we can use the example of hypercerts.
Yeah, so I think in the hypercerts case, the problem gets easier because um, hypercerts have this really, really nice property, which is like it. What I think is just so fundamentally amazing about this innovation is like, it lets you bottle impact the same way that currency bottles utility, right? So if you think about utility, it's just like the ability for somebody to get some benefit over something, right? Like that's very vague. What the hell does that mean? Well, it means if I am thirsty and I can get a glass of water and I can satisfy some need, then I got some utility out of that water. Or if I'm hungry, I can get some food. Or if I'm cold, I can get some clothes or whatever. And that utility is not the same all over the place, right? Like different parties have different needs at different moments in time. And even though those needs are somewhat similar in some cases, and there are broad clusters of activity, we found a really neat way of like making the whole system work by bottling the utility into this like corresponding interchangeable thing of like the currency units, which is I think like pretty neat. Impact certs or hypercerts give you the same structure, but with impact, where like you can now bottle the credit of having done something. And even though there's different clusters of parties that care about different kinds of impact, you can take those clusters of people that care about that kind of impact and create specific markets for those people where they can transact in that work. So for example, with like the green type credits, where you have communities that really care about improving the environment in some significant way, whether it's by fixing some carbon, pulling some carbon out of the atmosphere and fixing it, or whether it's by preventing carbon emissions in the first place, or whether it's by planting more trees, or whether it's by reducing the extinction of certain species. Like you can group and cluster people and organizations and institutions and governments into parties that care about those things and generate a market around that area. And so, for example, like today we have already impact certificates for fixing carbon, known as carbon credits. And there's very large, very robust markets already working there. And likewise, we can generate other markets in other specific areas. And so I would like really think through how to construct that market from the get-go, like how many institutions and groups and people both are there to do the impact and the work required, but are also care so deeply about that work happening that they're very willing to buy the impact certificates. I would stay away from markets where there aren't very clear buyers yet. You can maybe tackle that, but if you like really, really care about that work, but you will have to do a bunch of demand generation initially. And I think that's going to be harder than instead finding some area where there is already a lot of interest and a lot of demand, and you just have to change the structure, meaning you have to convince them to use a new transaction type in order to get the work done and in order to achieve the impact that they care about, but they already care about that. I think it's going to be harder to get people to care about something new that they didn't previously care about, and try to then also, in addition to that, get them to spend money trying to cause that impact. And so I would first start by like broadly looking at broad categories of impact where there's already massive amount of interest in getting the work done, but there are deep inefficiencies in how that work is being done today, where we could show up with like a concrete hyper-search market that could solve that problem for them and yield a higher efficiency system that makes it all work better. And I think like I would kind of prioritize the I would kind of like approach it that way. I think more generally for other mechanisms, I would kind of like still follow the same idea that like you want to go for groups and of entities where whether it's individuals or institutions already care about that work being done, and create that mechanism for them, as opposed to trying to draw attention to something new that they didn't previously care about. Maybe an example of doing this really well is Patreon. So I think like Patreon noticed this like interesting problem in the internet age where we already have the coordination technology to be able to like allocate and group together a lot of funding to be able to fund causes. And you had already deep interest in a lot of like nuance and niche areas of art creation. And you just didn't have a good way of connecting the people that wanted the art to the people producing the art. And they all had to go through these like mega labels, like mega processes. Like in music, for example, it would be like the record labels. So that means that the record labels tend to prioritize what is broadly interesting to the whole world, and like things that are like heavily marketable. And instead, Patreon kind of like created this environment where a community that really cares about some particular type of art can just fund that art, period. Like they don't have to go through any other party. And that was like a really, really good innovation, but it really already it was built for communities that already existed, meaning there were already artists trying to create that work. There were already people consuming that art that cared about that work. And once the system was put in place, then of course it could like extend and support new kinds of art and new kinds of artists that maybe otherwise wouldn't have ever considered taking that career or taking that path. And it definitely helped maybe a lot of people discover art that they didn't know about. But I think broadly the kind of structure of the market was already in place. You just needed a new transaction type. And so likewise here, I would like encourage finding other structures like that, where like there's already, you're really just finding two sides of a market that are not well connected and connecting them better. And creating new markets from scratch, I think, is much harder. It can also be done, and maybe like to offer some more thoughts to people trying to do that, I would maybe start by figuring out like who stands to benefit from something happening, who are all the parties that like really, really stand to benefit from it, and figuring out how much do they know about that benefit. Like, do they understand that they stand to benefit a lot from it? Do they understand that they that they need to take part in provisioning for that benefit to happen? And then at that point, you can kind of like propose a transaction structure that they then can fund the thing. So an example of doing this is like all of the work from climate scientists and policymakers in the 80s, 90s, 2000s in telling the world about climate change and global warming and the massive disasters coming ahead, in order to get everybody to understand the problem scale, so that then later all of these groups could actually do the work of kind of unwinding the climate problems. And so like you couldn't have a carbon emissions market before doing that work. And so that's an example of a market that like had to generate all of that awareness and interest first to then be able to like create a transaction type. But that takes a long time. And even today, like there's still an enormous amount of, crazily, there's still an enormous amount of controversy over this, even though there's like incontrovertible evidence on like all kinds of measurement instruments. You don't have to like try very hard to like convince yourself. But it's just kind of like an example of like how difficult it can be to coordinate a lot to cause the world to care about something that the world didn't previously care about. And so I think it's easier and faster to go after things that the world already cares about and help them structure it differently and better. And then later, maybe you can go after like the things that people don't yet care about.
Right. I'm wondering, if we're maximally successful in solving this problem in 10 years, what does the world look like?
Maximally successful in 10 years. I think if we can be maximally successful in, say, like the next 2-3 years, we'll then um, have pretty well structured, pretty robust mechanism for capital allocation. And sorry, Kevin, are you thinking about like the R&D pipeline specifically, or just broadly other public goods
Yeah,
things?
let's stick with the R&D pipeline specifically.
Yes, I think in 10 years, if we had a much better way of flowing value to the fundamental development part, I think in 10 years, realistically, we could scale crypto by, I want to say like two orders of magnitude, maybe three, and so that means like that would put crypto in the medium to large size country scale of economies. And at that point, we could be looking at funding fundamental development in the scale of like single billions a year, maybe 5 billion a year. I think 5 more years after that, we could scale to the scale of major nation states, and think at that point we could be realistically looking at funding R&D at the scale of like 50 to 100 billion a year. And that's the size of the U.S. Just for reference, like the U.S. spends about somewhere between 60 and 100 billion a year um, in non-defense R&D. The defense R&D is more than that, of course. Like another crazy fact. Spend a vastly more money in producing all kinds of defense technologies than in like saving lives and whatnot. But or it's saving lives in a different way. But like um, things like the broadest dangers to the world include like all the diseases, cancer, and all kinds of things like that, and they get like a fraction of the funding scale that they should be getting. And so I think if in 10-15 years we could be funding R&D at the scale of nation states, and if we can then especially fix this bottleneck problem, then we would have a pipeline that works dramatically better and faster, and we should be able to like shave years off of like the time it takes to go from a concept into a technology, into a product, into people's hands. And so we might shrink the time it takes to go from a fundamental discovery into a product from what it is now, like 20 to 25 years for like a lot of tech, and maybe in software like 10 years. And we can probably shave that down by like 50%, maybe more. I think AI tools are going to help a lot here. AI tools might shave that even more. Um, and so if you can maybe couple these like better funding structures, better capital allocation, and better AI tools, we could be looking at like really short circuiting this entire pipeline down to like single years in a lot of cases, or maybe like 5 to 10 years for other tech. And that would be just amazingly faster, right? Like that would like just double the rate of improvement in the world or more. And so you could both like parallelize and do a lot more, and you would be doing all of those things faster. So you might like you might do like exponentially more. You get to like accelerate the entire exponential that we're on. And I think that could be like tremendously successful and broadly beneficial for the whole world. Like we could be putting into tangible terms, like this could mean like making solar cells that are much more efficient and better at like capturing sunlight, or better batteries to store that energy, or better networks to that like give people more bandwidth, or better water treatment structures to like be able to like give everybody in the world like better water, faster time to cancer treatments, or any other kind of like broad disease, or even specific like drug development for specific diseases, like personalized medicine, like just broadly any branch of R&D, any branch of technology that you care about. You could get the benefits and the fruits of that entire branch of R&D much faster and at much higher scale if we can get this stuff right. So like this is kind of one of those root of all problems type of solutions. Like if you can kind of greatly accelerate the R&D pipeline, you then get all this broad downstream improvement globally. And so I think like this is among the most important problems to solve in the world.
Yeah, +1. Let's see. I guess we're getting towards the bottom of the hour, so we got to wrap up soon. But before we do, is there anything I didn't ask that you want to say?
Um, yeah, I think maybe like kind of a lot of people right now are probably interested in this work, but they don't know kind of like where to get started. And I think like what I would recommend to a lot of people is um, go find a lot of the communities that are experimenting with these new mechanisms. And so, go look at the improvements in like grants and structures like from Gitcoin. Go look at hypercerts, go look at credit attribution tools, go look through the libraries of content from Shelling Point and Fun in the Commons. Like there's a lot of good ideas that have been talked about there. Go look at like the DeSci community. And then once you find kind of like a set of projects that you're like really interested in, or you find like potentially like very exciting, go join those teams or like go contribute and collaborate with those groups. Like all of them are working openly in various Discords or Telegram groups or GitHub, and help figure out like the next range of experiments and the next range of things to do. I think right now, I think we were needing a lot more ideas 2 years ago. And that's kind of like why a lot of us started working on kind of getting the word out and getting a lot more people thinking about mechanisms. And I think a lot of great ideas have been proposed now. And where the bottleneck is today is in experimenting more. So I think we need more experiments, more development of more mechanisms. We need more data gathering of how well those mechanisms are working. We need more, we just need a lot more experimentation at this point. And so I think like trying out a lot of projects and collecting data on what's working and what's not working and kind of feeding into the whole, I think could be extremely, extremely successful. And so I think if we can like over the next couple of years experiment a lot, I think we can do better. One other plug I'll give now is like capital allocation is a high it's an intensive signal processing problem. Like it's really fundamentally about gathering a lot of information and making some predictions. And this is something that like ML models are extremely good at. And I think one of the things that has not been tried enough is to do better capital allocation using ML models. And so I think that today you could probably take your favorite LLM and give it the task of like coming up with good signal for better capital allocation. And it could probably do pretty well. I think you might have to work hard to like get it to work just right. Like you might, a lot of the early answers might be bad or like hallucinations or whatever. But I do think that like we could solve some really large problems by throwing AI at it. And I think that this is like way underexplored. And I think we might see like some great improvements on this in the next 2 to 4 years.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Juan, thanks so much for being on the Greenpill podcast. Have long been inspired by your work. And when I saw your talks at Zuzalu, I was like, oh man, we got to do a Greenpill episode about this. So thanks for coming on and riffing for an hour with us.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you. I just want to reflect a ton of appreciation for all of the work that you're doing, talking through all of these projects and mechanisms and helping lead the community in such an awesome way. Like I'm always super inspired by your GitHub threads and the memes and the podcasts. And I really think that as a, kind of like culture shapers have such a high leverage way of, solving problems broadly. And I think like, thank you for doing that. And thanks a lot of the people listening today for like doing a lot of that work broadly and like,
for sure,
coordinating us into a better future.
Yeah. I mean, I think that like about 2 years ago when you and I started working together a little bit more, I think we're reflecting back that the community builders, the culture shapers, the memeticists have a really symbiotic role to play with the deep researchers, the big brains at the table. And I'm just honored to be at the table with you all and trying to create a movement here. So it's been a lot of fun.
Awesome.
Cool. All right. Well, we'll see you next time. Thanks, Juan.
Take care. Bye.
Alrighty. Well, you just heard from Juan Benet. I'm very excited to talk to him. He has been a thought partner for me a long time with building the regen crypto movement. Protocol Labs and Gitcoin have worked together a lot. And I think some of the things that we talk about in this episode, hypercerts, productionizing R&D, are really germane to what we're trying to do with Greenpill Impact Season, try to figure out how do we actualize the vision of impact equals profit. So hope you enjoyed the episode, and thank you for listening to the GreenPilled.network podcast. Again, we are featuring people who are building a coordination, a network society of thousands of hackers, dreamers, and doers focused on using crypto to bring positive sum digital systems to the world, like Juan Benet, like Protocol Labs, like hypercerts. If you value our work, then you can collect this episode at pods.media/greenpill. If you go to that URL, you'll be able to collect this episode and others from Greenpill Impact Season. If you're not into doing something on chain, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It really helps the algorithm surface this podcast to other people who are interested in the Greenpill movement. Thanks again. See you next time. Peace and love.